Good morning. Continuing our journey in Hemshech, Samach Vav. We actually reached the end of the paragraph on top of page 53, but we're going to go back to page 52 because I skipped a parenthesis, which we're going to learn today. After establishing that through mitzvahs, we connect to the Primis HaRatzon, to the inner desire, the inner divine desire, because that's the Primis HaKavana, the ultimate purpose and desire of why God created existence, is in order to perform Torah mitzvahs there. So existence is a means to an end. And as such, it fits under the category of Ketzenis HaRatzon with all the different qualifications. The fact that it's connected to reason, the fact that it's finite, that it's murkav, it's a composite, and finally that it's fine, that it's and it's weak and it shifts based on circumstances. Where Primis HaRatzon is a solid, unwavering foundation that comes from the Ratzon HaPoshet of the divine God wants to have Torah mitzvahs. So in that sense, once we establish that, he said, "Bir Inyan" on page 52. To understand that, let's discuss the concept of Ur. Why all the Giluyim Elyonim are called Ur. And briefly, what he said was, I'm going over it again more than usual because this is a very fundamental topic, but also one that can be a little complex, especially the first time you hear or learn about it. Ur has the dual property. On one hand, it's only a reflection of a level above it, even though it originates from there, but it's a reflection. It's not a piece of it, so to speak, not a part of it. Like it says, it's not muhus lemuhus. That's how it is above. On the other hand, it has no other identity but expressing the levels above it. In other words, it's only a reflection, but it's nothing more than a reflection either. It doesn't add any other additives or elements, so to speak, because all it is an expression of, in this context, the divine, Ein Sof, or wherever you apply that word Oir. And as such, he compared it to the sunlight, that it's light of the sun. So it's only a light. It's not the sun itself, but it's a light only of the sun, meaning it's coming from the sun, and that's where it originates from. The second example was Er HaNefesh, the vitality that comes from the soul or the spirit that energizes someone. And he compared it to a garment, but not just the usual garment, a garment that's attached to the very body, like a snail is the example. Kadein kamtze, the levushim minei bay. So on one hand, it's a garment. On the other hand, the garment is not the detached one. It's part of an extension of the very body. Now, to mipsari echza, how do we find that within our beings? Where do we find an example of it in our personal lives? Or you could say in our personal structure, I would say, even better than lives. So we find that in Eisiyas HaMachshava. So on one hand, when we think of an idea, and that's Machshava, on one hand, it's an idea that's coming from a deeper place, a higher place. But that idea, because we're thinking of it and we are people of structure, there's some form of structure. And that's called Eisiyas HaMachshava. Those are the channels of expression of how this idea moves from a very amorphous and we call it abstract, intangible place to a tangible structure, which is whatever the idea is that we're thinking about. So here too you have dual properties. On one hand, it originates, like he said, from the nefesh. All the eisius come from atzmos nefesh, nefesh malei eisius. It originates there. But there, it doesn't have any shape and form. It's like the sunlight within the sun. It hasn't yet become something that you could talk about as a substantive form of expression. There's no expression yet. But it's still part of the nefesh. That's why we call it Vahiya Adam LeNefesh Chaya. The Targum says that means a speaking person, a speaking spirit. That means the very fact that he's alive, the part that speaks means the letters that he expresses originates from the very fact that he is a nefesh. But there's still a koyach. When actually manifests, and you're beginning the active process of thinking. Now, nasis machshava betzuras esis b'chinas geshem. Now, letters form that you can actually identify. And these letters that are the channels of expression of the idea are not the same, they're not commensurate to the etzem hanefesh. Just like light is not of the same substance as the source of light. Because in the source, ein sham agbola v'yischalkus. There's no finite, there are no parameters, and there's no distinction. And therefore, there's a very different qualitative shift from how the letters are in the nefesh and how they manifest once they're already active process of thinking. But on the other hand, sheirish hamshachase, the root of these letters didn't come from outside. Just like the root of the sunlight doesn't come from outside, it comes from the sun. So it's mamish, she says, like the example of the light of the sun within the reflection of the sun within the sun. And then it becomes a light that's outside of the sun that shines and illuminates and so on. Now, just for the record, well, it's more than just for the record. This whole piece that as I just reviewed and we learned yesterday, is almost word for word from a mimer from the Alter Rebbe, written by the Mittler Rebbe. And you can see that in footnote number 60, which refers to footnote number 1, if you want to know exactly, if you want to look it up, where it is. It's in Maimori Admor HaZakim in Yonim. The reason I say it is because when you read it, you could tell, if you're able to distinguish, you could see it's not that Rebbe Rashab's original language. Rebbe Rashab usually doesn't write in this way. This is very Alter Rebbe's language. But it's not the Alter Rebbe himself writing, it's the Alter Rebbe speaking, the Mittler Rebbe writing. So it has a certain Mittler Rebbe element to it too. Just that, not that it changes the understanding of it, but therefore you'll see like this whole concept of Eishis HaMachshava is a lot more abstract than what we learned before about light. But the truth is, the paragraph before about light is also from the Mittler, Alter Rebbe's mimer, this mimer. So all of this comes from there. But now comes a question. And that's what we're going to learn now, the parentheses. Based on this, and I'm surprised that no one picked up, maybe someone did pick up on this question. So the Rebbe Rashab himself is asking a question now. He poses it in a qualification, but it's a question. You just said in the previous paragraph, the example was light, oir, and the makar of oir. Like the light of the sun, sunlight, and the sun. Okay, understood. It has those dual elements. On one hand, it's only a reflection. On the other hand, it's a reflection of the sun. It is sunlight. Okay, same thing with Eir HaNefesh. Now when you say machshava, what exactly is the light and what exactly is the sun in when you talk about Eishis HaMachshava? Because based on what he's saying here, it sounds like that the machshava is the source, not machshava, I'm sorry, the koyach HaMachshava in the soul is the source, and the Eishis HaMachshava is the light. But Eishis are kelim. Letters are containers, much more compared to containers than to light. So how does the analogy work exactly? If you said it was the nefesh, the etzem nefesh, and the power of thought, okay, you could say the etzem nefesh is like the sun. It's its own reality, the core nefesh, and then there are keiches of the nefesh. Just like this chayes of the nefesh, like we said earlier. One of the keiches is koyach hamachshava or koyach hadibur, or for that matter, as I said, the chayes. That's like the light of the energy of the soul manifesting itself in energizing a body, or manifesting itself in energizing the power of thought. But here in the Maimer, and this is the Alter Rebbe actually saying it, you're saying it's Eishis HaMachshava. So this parenthesis we're going to learn now is going to address exactly that issue. If it's Eishis, it seems it's more connected to Kalim, not Eiris. So how does the flow work exactly here? Because the point he wants to make is why it's called Eir, he said. Why in the Kisra Rizal, all the Giluyim are called Eir and not Shefa. Eir. Not talking about keli. A keli actually is more like more like a shefa. A keli is not attached to its source. A keli is a separate entity, the koyach hagvul of the Eibishter, to contain the oir. So how is he comparing that to Isis? That's the operative question on the table that the Rebbe Rashab is now going to address in the parentheses I'm going to read, which is the first line literally in the new paragraph on page 52. So we're going back now. After establishing the comparison between Isis and Machshava to light, as light is compared to the sun, Isis and Machshava compared to the letters as they are in Etzem HaNefesh, we're going to go back to that first line in the new paragraph, second paragraph on page 52.
Can I ask a question or two before we get into that?
A question on the question?
Yeah. Well, on the terminology, when we say osios hanefesh, when we're talking about a nefesh, I'm assuming we're talking about a nefesh hamaskelis here. That this whatever
Not necessarily. He doesn't say that. He just says the nefesh. Esis, hanefesh meleya esis, he says.
All right. But when we say, sorry, we're talking about, we're studying how intellect and how the thought process develops in all of people. That there's correct. This. So the idea of a formation of osios and so on.
Yes.
But are these osios? Are they osios as we understand them, like the language that we use, or if we're talking about osios hanefesh, is this something that
we're talking about? Those are the two stages he's talking about. Both the osios hanefesh don't yet have defined parameters, and the osios hamachshava, when you're actually thinking of an idea, it does have defined parameters. So he's comparing those two stages, exactly what you're saying. How those letters get formed from the state that they're not yet formed in the nefesh, in a more abstract, a nebulous form, and when then they do become formed and shaped in machshava. That's he's talking about that process.
So the osios hanefesh is this if somebody was
there's nothing. He calls it ein sham hagbola v'ischalkus. It's completely abstract. It's only a source. It's like light coming from the sun. It's just like the sun. It's a source of the letters, but it's not letters.
Okay. So, and as far as, I mean, do we think that at least in the Nefesh Elokis that there are any osios that would be Lashon HaKodesh?
This is not relevant to Nefesh Elokis, Nefesh Habamis. This is Nefesh. This is general, when it says that God imbued, he says, Vayhi la'adam le'nefesh chai. He took a clump of earth, right? And breathed a soul into it. It's not relevant here whether it's divine or animal or that's not. It's the idea of a spirit. So the Targum calls that spirit a speaking spirit.
Right.
Nefesh ruach memalala.
Right.
You read that.
Okay,
so it means it has within it the power of the ability to communicate, the ability to express, I would say. That's the power of letters in the nefesh. So the nefesh is a built-in ability to speak. That's why I explained yesterday that children don't need to go and download. You don't have to download language into them. They already have language in their soul. It just hasn't yet been formed, and they need to learn how to speak from those around them. But it doesn't take long. If they had to actually learn to think of an art that's acquired, you don't learn that in a year or two. It could take many, many years. So the fact is they already have the concept of language in their soul. That's on the soul level. Then comes the next stage when those letters actually become formed and the child begins to actually speak. Or for that matter, the same thing with thought. The letters are there, and when you actively trigger the thought process, it begins to actually take on shape.
Just a quick.
So I'm not sure
connection.
What is unclear.
No, I just wanted to understand if this was, we're talking about all Seichel and Nushi, that this is the process of all people, all B'nai Adam. This is the intellectual process.
Yeah,
all have this ability of language before one has actually learned a language. It's the ability to
This applies to all human beings, every human being.
Yes. So I can't help but drawing the connection. We spoke many weeks ago. We talked about of a hint of chachma or of spheres even before above Atzilus, even perhaps pre-Tzimtzum.
I
There.
wouldn't go there because he's not comparing which level this is. This could be within Atzilus, this can be Keser, this could be many different
No,
places
no.
you can
In
apply this.
the idea that there can be the hint of or the framework
The
pre-framework
general
of.
concept
Yeah.
that things begin first in a completely shapeless and seamless state,
Yes.
and
Okay.
then the things begin. That general concept can be comparable, but I wouldn't
Okay.
compare a particular level to which level.
No, no, that's what I was referring to. The idea of not having it
Yeah, but that's in
formulated.
general true because
Yes.
God is one. And from
Right.
one to become a multitude, you need to go through a stage from a state of complete seamlessness, like Ur Ein Sof
Right.
before the Tzimtzum is Ur Poshet, or
Right.
like we learned Ratzon. And then the Tzimtzum and so on creates structure.
But even before the structure, there could have been a hint of it or the possibility.
I don't know what the word is. That's another discussion which I wouldn't go
Okay.
into right now.
Okay.
Because what does
Fine.
hint mean? Does it mean a hint, or does it mean God is simply envisioning the structure?
Yes. I lack the language myself to clarify it, but all right.
It is
Right.
relevant to the bigger discussion, but I'd rather reserve that
Yes.
discussion later because it'll just confuse matters here.
Okay. No, it was very helpful just clarifying the terms as we go forward.
Fine,
Yes.
fine.
Thank you.
Sure. So now, back to the paragraph on page 52, he says like this. So I'm going to start from the beginning of the paragraph so we maintain the flow. So he said, Valderech Moshe Mepsari Echza, for example, Mepsari Echza, from our flesh we grasp, Yuvan Zeh Me'esis HaMachshava. We'll understand this from the letters of Machshava. So here the Rebbe Rashab right away jumps in the parentheses. What do you mean the letters of Machshava? We're talking about Ur and Moir, a light and the source of light. Esis HaMachshava, as soon as you say Esis, what are we referring to? So that's exactly what the parentheses comes to address. Hine Esis HaMachshava and Bechinas Kalim Ki Yadua. The letters of Machshava are Kalim as it's known. The idea itself is the Ur. Ur Machshava is the idea. But the letters are the way that the idea is being expressed. When you, for example, say 2 + 2 = 4. So there's a concept, that's the Ur, and there's the actual words that I just said. You're expressing it in a term, in a formula, or however you define the Esis HaMachshava. Says, Kiyadua, these are Kalim. And he actually, I see below, they send us to footnote number 68. Okay, yeah. The Kamavur Zeh al Inyan Ha'eres. And here in this mimer, and again, this is the mimer of the Alter Rebbe written by the Mittler Rebbe, he's explaining Esis HaMachshava on Inyan Ha'eres. So you don't see a question, he's not asking a kasha. I just posed it that way, but it definitely needs explanation what's going on. Because if it's Kalim, and here he's explaining like Eres, so right away you see that's not a problem. You could say Esis HaMachshava, you could explain it as Ur, and the Ur is coming from the Etzem HaNefesh, that would be the Moir, the source. And the Esis, now he is speaking as Ur, but Ur as a reflection, as a channels of expression. But he's going to go and dissect this a little more in detail, understanding about the Eres and Kalim of the Esis HaMachshava. Now, before I continue, let me say, this isn't just a tangential footnote. It's actually very relevant to the whole discussion, because keep in mind, the whole point here, let's not lose sight of the big picture here, the whole point here is how we interface with the divine. How we, human beings of structure, connect to something that is beyond structure. Or to put it even in more practical terms, if we did not have the ability to speak to each other, like I'm doing right now with you, we would not be able to have a full relationship. Because you wouldn't know what I'm thinking, you wouldn't know what I want. Yes, you could make body language, hand movements, but it would be quite limited. And scientists, even secular scientists, will tell you that language was the first thing that allowed the human race to evolve and become a very sophisticated intelligence because they could collaborate. So even though animals also have a particular language, and the same with, you can say, even vegetation, but you see, they've not developed the intelligence that humans have. Humans have learned to conquer animals that are far bigger than they are. If animals had our intelligence, that would not have happened. Well, we'd have a real competing element. We figured out how to conquer something that's 100 times larger than us and stronger than us. I'm not going now into discussing the levels of intelligence of animals, but the point, a big part of it, is our koyach ha'oisius. That's oisius ha'machshava, and then oisius ha'dibur. That's why the Targum Onkelos says nefesh chaya is not just a living soul, it's a speaking soul, meaning a soul of language. Even if you're not actually speaking, but you have the capacity to do so. So there's actually a fascinating sikha from the Rebbe. Anybody, if you're interested in understanding why we're called medaber, when we say doimem tzemeach chai medaber. So doimem is mineral, the mineral world. Tzemeach is the world of vegetation, right? What we call a flora. And then you come fauna, you come the world of chai, the animal kingdom. So why is a human being called medaber? Medaber means the speaker. It should have said the bar seichel, the masculine, the one with seichel. Dem semeach chai masculine. Or chacham. I mean, there's a lot of terms. Why medaber? So the Rebbe there in that sikh, it's Yisrei, Chelik Vav. He explains because dibur is the ability to go beyond yourself, the ability to speak to someone else and to listen to them. And that means we can go out of our own egos and get an understanding of something from another person. Because the fact is we're subjective creatures, and if we didn't have the power of dibur, we wouldn't have the concept of being able to learn from each other and communicate to each other and ask questions like teacher, student. So medaber expresses what he calls there the ability for a person, trying to remember the exact word he uses. He uses the word, I believe he uses the word pshitus, I think is the word he uses, meaning to break out from your limited structure, and that's what dibur captures. So it's not just the ability to speak, it's the ability to communicate with someone else and listen to them and learn from them, and they can learn from you. So it creates a whole new type of collaboration that you would not have without that. So I'm focusing on dibur, but really what we're talking about is oisius. Now, why am I elaborating? Because this comes to tell you that the idea of oisius is relevant to that interface that we're talking about. For us, people of structure, to connect to each other, and definitely to connect to the divine, what's the interface? What are the channels that connect us? So oisius plays a tremendous role. They play the role of the channels of expression that we've been speaking about, allows one level to express itself. The same thing with sunlight. If there was only a sun and no light, there's no way we would be able to get the heat and the warmth and the light of the sun, because if we got too close to the sun, we get burned. The sunlight allows a certain distance that the sun can give off light. It travels millions of miles. The light becomes far more diminished and far more receptive, and we're capable of receiving it. If we were too close to the sun, as I said, or too distant, it wouldn't work. So sunlight serves as an interface between the sun and the earth, which allows for life. So bottom line is, oir, in the moshel of the shemesh, and now we're talking about oisius, are all interfaces. So this parenthesis that is, you can phrase it, frame it like this. What is the interface? Is the the interface or the keli? And the answer is, of course, both. Because we know in Seder Shtalshus, the plays a role. The kelim is more the role of so-called channeling it into our structure. The plays the role of reflecting the divine. So it's only a reflection, but it's only a reflection, meaning it is reflecting divine godliness. Whereas the keli is not a reflector. The keli is a receptacle. It receives. And both are necessary in the interface. So though he's not going to elaborate everything I just said and what I just discussed here, but just pointing out that this is not just some side point Oiris and Kalim, it's all part of the bigger picture of understanding the interface between the divine and existence, and ultimately going back to Oir. But let's continue now reading as he explains. It says, so it's known, he says, Eis are Kalim. However, here, the Kanmavor Zal Inyana Oiris. Here he's explaining Eis Samachshava on Oiris. And now he's going to bring different sources and show how both of them are vital, and just really elaborate more on this distinction. So he says like this: Ube'etz Chaim, Shar Seder Abiyah Pei Gimel. In Eitz Chaim, that's the result. In the Seder Abiyah, it's called one of the sections. Chapter 3, Pirish, he says, he explains as follows: the machshava hu ha'oyer hamispashet ba'atzilis. He says, thought. What is thought, Lamaila? It's the light the energy that expands, mispashet, that expresses or expands in Atzilus. What does that mean, however? He says oir. He doesn't say keli. He says the oir that mispashet, machshava. Now, does he mean the oisis of machshava? Does he mean the thought itself? So let's see how he explains it. But he brought that Eitz Chaim. So you can see here the Rebbe Rashab is grounding this topic in sources and going to try to elaborate. And that's right, he's going to elaborate on understanding it all. So he says, Yesh Leimer, the Rebbe Rashab's Yesh Leimer says, perhaps you can say, Lefisha levusha machshava hu levusha meyuchad im ha'oir. How do you reconcile that, the fact that oisis a machshava are kelim in general, and here they're explained as oir, and in Eitz Chaim he calls it oir hamispashet? He says because machshava is a particular type of levush. It is a levush. We know it's a levush, a garment, like dibur ha'maisa, machshava dibur ha'maisa are three levushim, but it's a levush hamiyuchad im ha'oir hamelubish b'teichei. So let me explain what that means. So in Tanya, when he explains the 10 koiches, there's 10 faculties, which is Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, Malchus. Two general categories: the cognitive, conscious faculties, Chachma, Bina, Das, and the emotional faculties, which is Chesed through Malchus. Good. Then he says that there are 3 garments. They're called Levushim. Machshava, Dibur, Maisa. So let's first just establish what that means. What's the difference between the two? And why are these called koiches and these are called levushim? So koiches literally means faculties. It's the nefesh has, the soul has faculties. It's like branches of a tree. There's the tree, and the tree has branches. Here's 10 branches, if you wish. 10 faculties. A levush is not a koyach. A levush is a garment. What's a garment? A garment you can remove, and you can dress and remove all the time. It's not part of the skeleton of your body. I'm talking about the regular garments. We're not talking about the garment that he described earlier. We'll get to that shortly. Now, how does it play itself out practically? The koiches are faculties that are always there. Think of it, your hard drive. Whereas your levushim is like the soft drive. What does that mean? Your computer, and the same thing, your brain, has in it millions of ideas. Chachma, Bina, Das have developed ideas through your lifetime and even as we speak. But that doesn't mean you're actively expressing them or actively using them. So when we bring up a topic, for example, and now you're concentrating on a particular thought, what you're doing is you're drawing from your vast inventory or repository of millions of ideas of Chachma, Bina, Das. That's the faculties. And now you're actively accessing it using the example of the computer. That's the file that you're looking at is among thousands of files on your computer, but you're not accessing them. Those are like the koiches. The levushim is when you're activating one, you're thinking about an idea. That turns the koyach is now manifesting in the levush called machshav. Now, if, for example, you get distracted and you were thinking about, let's say, an idea in Samach Vav, and then someone calls you on the phone and they need something, some type of menial thing. So your machshava, immediately the garment moves away from the idea that you were focusing on and now dresses up a different idea. That's why it's a lavush. Because machshava on its own is like a garment hanging in a closet. Until you don't fill it with an idea from the brain, or you can also say the midis from the heart, like chesed, it's just an empty garment. On the other hand, if you only have the koiches and not lavush, the koiches remain dormant. They remain like files on your hard drive, but you're not accessing them. When you're asleep, I'm not talking about dreaming now. So most of your ideas remain in your brain. They're there. They're stored there. Those are koiches. When you bring a koyach into an actual expression, that becomes a lavush. So the lavush is just a garment. There are 3 levels of lavushim. Machshav is an expressing to yourself. You're consciously thinking of the idea. Dibur is an expression to another. You're speaking about it. I mean, you could also speak to yourself, but it's already a form of next level of expression. And Maisa is, let's say you write it down, then it becomes a 3rd level of expression. So there's only 3 ways to express yourself. Either to yourself, machshava, dibur to another, or Maisa, you create something out of it. You write an article, a book, a paper, you build something from it, etc. So in a way, just to drive the point home, whenever I remember teaching this to high school students when they started learning Chassidus, I just wanted to give a practical application, and then I'll get back to where we are, because it's all part of this. In a way, all of education is actually learning how to draw from the koiches into the levushim. Let me explain. You can find, in every class you'll find students that are brilliant. They're brilliant, but they're very shy. They don't speak up. And people sometimes think that they don't have anything to say, and even think that they may be stupid. Then at some point you discover this person who rarely speaks is quite brilliant. How would you define that in the koiches levushim formula? You would say the koiches are very powerful, but the levush has not developed. The levush hadibur. Whatever reason, either this person is shy, or maybe they find it difficult to speak. They may, God forbid, stutter, or some other reason. That doesn't mean the koyach is not intact. It just means the koyach is there, but it's like, think of like water in a well, but you don't have any buckets to draw the water up, or oil well, and you don't have tools and instruments to draw the oil, the resources out of the ground. So actually education, if you think about it, I just gave an extreme example, but the truth is with everyone. What are you really training a person when they're studying in school? What's an education? You're not training them to have faculties. They were born with faculties. Nobody can give you chachma bina das. They can give you ideas to fill your chachma bina das, but more importantly, train you how to think. Many people have brilliant ideas, but they don't know how to think in an organized manner, or don't know how to speak in an organized manner, or don't know how to write in an organized manner. And it's not a technicality, because when you learn to refine and polish your levushim, they then are in a position like good buckets and good tools and good garments that can draw more of the koiches. So essentially, training someone good methodology in the machshava dibur maisa level, how to think properly, how to speak properly, and how to write properly, or build something properly, is actually allows you to access the koiches much better than someone that does not have the levushim so developed. So you will have people, for example, who have the levushim is stronger than their koiches. There are people, for example, who can speak very well, but they're not as smart and they're not as brilliant as another person who cannot speak so well. So there you would say his levush is stronger than his koyach, so to speak. Actually, you can't really say that, because the koyach is always more than the levush. But the levush is much more evolved, whereas another person's koyach may be very powerful, but the levush is not yet developed. This is basically when you're saying to someone, you have a relationship in marriage, but you weren't taught tools. You can love someone, but you don't have the tools. Either you didn't have a role model, or you never developed tools properly, or you had negative role models. This is all about bridging koiches that remain somewhat within you, and learning how to express them properly. Why is this all so critical here? Because let's go back now to machshava. So the difference between machshava and dibur, as garments go, machshava is called a levush miyuchad, hamiyuchad, like he says. Why? Because even though it's a garment, but it's a garment that's attached to the idea. Oh, it's only you're thinking to yourself. So it's still a garment, but it's a garment that's still within you. Dibur, even though it's still coming from your mouth, and therefore flowing from your mind and your heart, but it's called a levush hanifred. Because firstly, you can record the letters, the words, but even with 4 recordings, someone else hears them, they can repeat them, they have already in a sense left you. So it's called a levush hanifred because it's somewhat no longer completely within you. That's why it's important before a person speaks, they should think through what they're saying, because once you say it, you can't always pull it back. You may say something that later you regret, or you didn't say it properly, etc. That's why it says in the Gemara that before a person speaks in public, they should review it 4 times. Beinei dalet ponim, beinei lebein atzmei. The Rebbe Rashab, for example, even saying maftir, which he knew quite thoroughly, obviously, even when he said maftir Shabbos, he would review it 4 times privately. Because before you dibur, always make sure that you thought it through properly. Dibur is already, in a sense, you've released it. Obviously, you can change your mind and say, I want to correct myself. But the fact of the matter is, it's already letters of expression that have, so it's called a levush hanifred. So what the Friedrich Rebbe Rashab is saying here, that yesh leimer, why you could say machshav is both a oir and a keli, he's saying like this. So levush ha-machshav hu levush ha-miyuchad ima oir. So it's a levush on one hand, because the koyach is the faculty, levush, machshav is already an expression, but it's a connected expression. In a way, it's similar to levushim menei ubei that he said earlier, like the garment that's part and parcel of a snail. So it is a garment, but it's part of the body. Hamalubish beteche. So it's united with the oir that's malubish within it. Now, is dibur united? Not quite the same way. Dibur is already words that are tangible. So of course, it's still expressing an idea, but that's why machshava, that's why dibur is more difficult than machshava. Because now you have to bring it down to another level, that another person could have to understand it. So it's already removed one step from the oir of the idea itself. That's why the oir is also called machshava. So even though generally speaking, machshava is a levush, or a keli, like he said, but you can still call the oir machshava because the machshava is basically a keli or a levush, but also an oir because it's connected to the oir. It's very close to it. So it's not the same like a garment or a keli that is removed one step away from the oir. That's the first thing he said right now. And you see that again. Machshava is exactly that you can, for example, understand an idea well and you can't explain it so easily. Why not? Because explaining requires going to the next level of keli or levush that requires much more effort. Whereas machshava is still, it's within you, so it's closer to the, let's call it the mouth of the well. That's the first thing he says about machshava. Let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything.
Could we say that the koiches are part of the nefesh, or the levushim are an extension of the nefesh, outside of the nefesh?
I wouldn't use the word outside, and I wouldn't use the word nefesh. We know like this. It's called nefesh neise keiches. The nefesh was created by God in a way that it carries the capacities that we call the faculties. So let's say the power of vision, to see. Now, if a person doesn't have a body, or God forbid their eyes aren't functioning, the koyach is still there. But how would you define that koyach? What tangible way? You're not going to open up the soul and find a power of vision. It's a power, it's a capacity. But the nefesh has that capacity. For example, a stone doesn't have that capacity. So the nefesh has what's called koiches. Koiches simply means capacities, powers, if you wish. And they were blessed with 10 faculties. That's how Hashem created the nefesh. He could have created with 5 faculties, or with 1, or with 20, but he created 10. conscious faculties, chachma, bina, das, and so on. So a koyach is essentially, I would call it a power, a capacity of the soul. But it's not the soul itself, because the soul is not defined by koyches. The soul is more than the sum of the parts. The soul is not a composite of 10 faculties. There's a soul.
Like the engine.
You could use that word. You could use the word the soul is the life force. Remember, the soul also has nefesh, ruach, neshama, chay, yechida. So the soul also has levels. It depends what you mean. If you're talking about chelik elikam emal mamish, the soul is vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, then it's a divine energy that God imbued inside a human being. If you're talking about the nefesh habamis or the nefesh hasichlis, then you're talking about other aspects of nefesh. So you have to define what you mean by nefesh in general.
But the levush is not part of the nefesh at all. It's only the vessel to bring it out to something else. Correct?
I explained how I explained it. If the words you just said make sense to you, great.
No,
I would
because
use different words
you
a bit.
if there's no goof.
Yeah, but on the other hand, God forbid, a corpse doesn't have machshava dibur u'maisa either. That means a human being has to be alive to have levushim too.
Of course.
But why they call
levushim?
The reason they're called levushim is not because they're separate, because they are essentially only empty. They're only channels of expression. That's all they are. They're like clothing in a closet. I mentioned clothing. Okay. Clothing is not right. Exactly. The skeleton, your skeleton, the bone structure, is part of your very body. The garment, like the jacket you put on, is already an expression. Right. So on Shabbos, you put on Shabbos-dika clothing. But you could peshet levush, the levish levush. You could address, like I said, a thought. You can have a thought about an idea, and then your thought changes. The garment, you can change the garments. You can never change your faculties.
That's why Rabbi Yochanan called the levushim mechabidusa.
Yeah, right.
Call them what?
But you can't change keiches. For example, you could develop your keiches. You could train them. You can sharpen them. But just like you can't change the color of your eyes, you don't change keiches. Levushim you could change all the time. What you're thinking about, you could think about something of holy kedusha, and you could, God forbid, think about something that's not appropriate. And 1 second to the next, like changing clothing, literally. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, but so far what he said here, therefore, it's a levush miyuchad, and that's why nikra oir gamke b'shem ha'machshava. So
can I ask you a question?
Also b'shem ha'machshava, which is exactly what the Alter Rebbe is saying in this mimer, that he's comparing it to the oir of the sun, the sunlight. So it's not the sun, it's not the nefesh, machshava, like we said. The nefesh is a different level, but it is a so-called reflection of the nefesh because it's miyuchad with it. Are there any other questions about what we've learned so far?
The levushim, I guess, can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yeah, a couple questions. So the levushim for machshava are the same as the levushim for for a nefesh, which is.
No, one second. I didn't understand. Machshava is a levush.
Machshava is a levush. Okay. Okay.
Machshava is the process of actively thinking about something. Seichel is the thing you're thinking about. Seichel, as I said, is like a file on your computer. Machshava is when you draw that file to your home page and you're looking at the file.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And how are we distinguishing?
Listen, if it's confusing, I would suggest the following, because if it's the first time you're learning this or hearing this, I would suggest listening again to this class, because it takes time. I can tell you for myself, it took me quite a while to be able to fully understand how seichel, how keiches work and how levushim work. So you may have, it's fine to have questions. I'm happy to answer them. But to really understand this, I would review it a few times, think about it, and see practical ways you could. That's why I'm giving these examples, like the computer and so on.
I agree. Thank you.
Let's say like dibur. speech. I could speak about anything. I could speak now. We're speaking Samach Vav. In 5 minutes from now, or a minute from now, we can start speaking business or sports or about what are we going to buy for Shabbos. So dibur is essentially an empty garment. The word dibur itself. What you're going to speak about, it depends what you're going to. Like I said with the computer, what are you drawing? What koyach are you drawing into your dibur? You could say, I want to say, I love you to someone. Then you're taking av or chesed. The koyach of chesed is manifesting in the koyach hadib, in the levush hadibur. Or if you think about love, so the koyach chesed is manifesting in the levush hamachshava. See what I'm saying? So the levushim are essentially like I mentioned, the instruments, the pail that draws the water. It's not the water itself. In Tanya, obviously, he elaborates of that. The goal is, of course, when you learn Torah and Mekayim mitzvahs, what you're doing is your koiches are investing in your machshava dibra ma'isa, and living up to doing those Torah mitzvahs. For example, a Beinani, in Tanya's language, the koiches of the Beinani, he has koiches of the nefesh habamis, but his levushim, his machshava dibra ma'isa, are controlled by his nefesh lekis. So what he's thinking about, what he speaks about, and what he does is driven by the nefesh lekis. That doesn't mean the nefesh habamis is not trying to entice him and seduce him, but he stops it because he has self-control. So that's a perfect example where the levushim are being controlled by nefesh lekis, and by a rasha with tevlei, the levushim are controlled by both. Sometimes the nefesh lekis is controlling what you're going to think, speak, and do. And sometimes the nefesh habamis does. So the levushim is essentially the manifestation, the activation of the faculties.
That's why the Alter Rebbe is saying in Perek Dalet that the levushim is a very, very powerful thing.
Exactly. He says it's rooted even higher. Yeah. Exactly. But I'm happy to take questions. I mean, this is the topic here. He's not really going through a whole discussion of levushim and koiches. I did that because in order to understand what he's saying, we need to have some background. But you want to ask anything else, anyone?
Is a lavush a keli?
Since they're both Hebrew, tell me, why don't we use English words? What do you mean by lavush and what do you mean by keli?
Well, I mean, literally, lavush is a garment. It encapsulates something, and a keli is a vessel that contains something.
Well, why can't you say a lavush is a keli and a keli is a lavush in general terms?
Well, I have no problem with that. Was my question.
So to me, I need to understand the meaning, not I don't have the words I explained. I explained it as best as I can explain it.
Levush
and keli can be interchangeable at times, and sometimes not, depending on the context. Yeah. Here he's going even further. He's calling even kelim and oisius of machshava oir. So you see, sometimes keli and oir are even interchangeable.
Yeah, that's why it's confusing. I always thought oisius were kelim for or. That's how I understood it always.
Okay, so listen, that's why you learn more chassidus and you come to realize it's a lot more, like I've always said, there's no definitive levels in chassidus. Everything is relative.
Yeah. I agree that this class needs to be reviewed. I mean, when you think you know it, but you don't. So I'm saying for myself, I'm not talking about you.
No, I think you know it, but then there's always more to know. Look at it that way.
Yeah, this is really good stuff, and I appreciate your patience with us, your students. In
remember, I've mentioned a number of times, in Atzilus, everything is ruchnius, right? Spiritual. So if someone says, "What's the difference between the Oris and Kalim of Atzilus?" There are no containers in your kitchen. Yes, you put water in a kettle, you put milk in a container, you put we have pots and pans. So in physical world, we understand there is oir and a keli, electricity in a light bulb or an appliance. But in ruchnius, even the kelim of Atzilus, you can say are oir compared to bria. You understand? You have to really get to understand that these are words that are meant to be. That's why it's important to get beyond the semantics. you talk about like the idea and the letters on a page would be like Oiris and Kalim. But on a higher level, the letters on a page could also be like Oir for a person who's not familiar with these ideas. So everything is relative ultimately in a certain way. So it all comes down to understanding that everything needs, there's energy and there's the expression of that energy. In our context, I would basically say the koiches are the abilities. Like I said, the hard drive, all those files. It could be millions of ideas, billions of ideas in your brain. And the vushim is when they are expressed in a particular way. A thought. You can't have, for example, two thoughts at the same time, but you could have millions of faculties all residing within your system at the same time.
I think that kelim and levushim are in some things the same thing, but in some things kelim is expressing only that something to absorb the oil. Levushim is expressing something to give lower the oil.
I don't think you're going to find a definitive distinction because it depends which mimer you go to. In Ayin Bays, maybe I don't remember if many of you may not have been there because it was more in volume 1. He discussed this at length, Oiris, Kalim, Levushim, and explained that it's relative ultimately. It depends. The Kalim of Atzilus compared to Bria are like Oir. The Levushim of Atzilus compared to Bria can be even Oir. So it all comes down to the real Oir, you could say, is only Lifnei Tzimtzum because there's no Kalim altogether. Even
because
the Kav.
Levush,
Anyway.
in Gashmias, a levush is not serving any purpose except for the person to come out in the world. A keli is
yeah, but that happens to be that could be the difference between life and death. What do you mean? It's not a small matter.
Yeah, but the purpose of levush, the word
if a person, for example, says, "I'm a good Jew at heart," but then they do something that's an aveda in their levushim, that's a serious matter.
That's a different thing. What
do you mean?
No,
because we're not talking about
definition.
Jackets now. We're not talking about jackets and pants. We're talking about levushim as expression of your faculties in this world.
No, but I am talking about jacket and pants, which is explaining the purpose of the world.
But it's a muscle. That's a muscle to understand what machshava dibur ma'aseh is. Yeah.
I learned a very interesting fact that a Sefer Torah is a levush for Torah. Just amazing. I think about it all the time.
What is a levush? What is a levush?
A Sefer Torah is a levush of Torah. I loved it. I loved it when I heard it, and I think about it. It's great.
Okay.
What was the idea, Tzvi? A Sefer Torah is a levush for what?
For Torah.
For Torah.
Uh-huh.
Torah is expressed by the levush, but it's the Torah that we see in shul and that we read from is basically a levush of Torah,
Yeah.
which is such a high concept you can't even
I think a Sefer Torah is not only a levush; it's a levush that contains the Torah.
That's the whole point, I think.
Well, there's different levels of levushim, and in Tanya he says Torah is yarda v'nosa v'yarda. From, remember, in its highest level, it's completely shashuyim hamelech batzmusei, shashuyim lefonov, and it's a zayse v'kudshe brichu kulachad, and then it like evolved until it came down into actual letters, and it was given at Matan Torah, and like you said, written down in a Sefer Torah or engraved in the luches, in the tablets, and then a lower level is the Sefer Torah. So these are all levels of the Torah manifesting in Kalim or Levushim and so on. But again, in this context, I would not, unless a mimer says explicitly it's a Keli, not a Levush, or a Levush, not a Keli, I would not speculate on that because you can explain it many ways. And in many different places, you'll find. For example, it says that Torah is both a Levush and there's the expression, Eite Kisalma, right? That he wrapped light like a shirt. There you have Oir is like a Levush. Oir compared to Etzem is like a Levush. So you see right there, that's not so black and white. The bottom line is, I would not get stuck on definitions here. I would try to understand the concept. It's all about the concept. When you, for example, teach a student, let me just give you this example, and a student needs a mushal, you need to give them an analogy. The student would not understand the idea without an analogy. So the analogy could be called a lavush, could be called a keli too, but let's say a lavush. Another person does not need the analogy. So basically, for the person who doesn't need the analogy, they get the oyer is already for them a keli. They understand it because of this, because they understand the idea. They don't need another extra lavush. The other person needs it. So it's all relative, based on who it is and what they're receiving.
But also in Ayin
Anyway,
base,
bottom line is like this. I as often, I don't, the goal of this class is not to do an elaborate overview of Keiches and Levushim. I only said enough to help understand what he's saying here. There are places where Chassidus, where it's discussed. This is not really the place he's coming to explain Keiches and Levushim. I felt it necessary because it would be hard to understand everything he's saying here without that background. But if you go to some of the sources down below, the footnotes, if you really want to learn it properly, there are plenty of places that talk about this.
Jacobson, but in Ayin base, there was a concept when we talk about Or and Keli, it was always about the blending, meaning that the higher up you were, it was more Or and less Keli, and as you came down the different levels, became more Keli and less Or. But
okay.
I'm not sure if you could apply that concept to the levushim.
Why not? I told you,
Because
Keli and Levush can be interchangeable.
Okay.
It depends
So it's
what you
still
mean
a
by
blending.
Levush again. We're going back to the same thing. You're trying to pigeonhole Keli and Levush into a certain level, and you can't do that. Because in many, I just gave a pasuk, it says in Tehillim, Oita salma. God wraps light like a salma, like a shirt. So is it or is it a shirt?
Makes sense.
It's all relative. And actually that pasuk is used, that in Torah there's two levels. There's the Torah that's called Torah, and there's Torah that's called a Levush. Okay, good. It's fine. We'll review it as many times as we need till we get it clear. He's far from finished. He just gave one explanation about this. He's going to speak more about it in the next section. That's why I wanted to do the parentheses separate from the idea itself. So let's stop here. You'll see right after he says, "Oh yesh lemer be'efen kazeh," or is another way to explain it. Or I don't know another way. Oh yesh lemer explained be'efen kazeh in this manner. So we'll get to that in the next class. We'll stop here. We did 3 lines, which is fine. Page 52, the beginning of the parentheses in the second paragraph. Okay, we'll stop here. Good.